But there are a lot of incredible pieces of art that are put into kind of telling those stories from the Bible in a visual way. And part of that is because people can't read. And so when you're in the middle of a religious ceremony and you're kind of trying to keep everybody's attention and you're trying to impart the meaning, you can't necessarily do that with words. And so one of the ways that it's kind of important to do that is through things like elaborate altar paintings and the kind of the gold finery. Like those are all important elements of telling a story in a very visual way. And so I think those are also markers of a pre-literate culture.
Hi, welcome to Minds Over Matters. Today's guest is Mikhaila Redovian. She knows everything there is to know about one of the most dramatic cultural shifts in history, the transition from the Dark Ages to the Enlightenment. Stick around. We're going to learn some stuff today. Hi.
Hello.
Tell me about the Dark Ages. And I'm going to use the word Dark Ages because it's the language that I'm comfortable with. I know there are different ways to refer to it, probably more accurate ways, but how would you characterize that time?
Yeah, so you're bringing up, first of all, a really excellent point about what that time period is called. I think in popular nomenclature, the Dark Ages is what a lot of people are familiar with. But I think in more academic circles, we would refer to that period as the medieval period. And that is kind of the period between... and I'm not a historian, so maybe don't quote me on this. But that's kind of the time period between like the classical age and right about 1450. And I think the name Dark Ages is used especially to describe what is happening kind of from a European standpoint, and is used to kind of cast aspersion on this time period as being religious and backwards and sort of culturally stagnant. But if you look beyond Europe, it's actually a massive time of cultural flourishing. There are the establishment of the Silk Road. There's a lot of cosmopolitan movement of people and products and ideas from India and China through Persia, through Turkey. North Africa has a really active trade network. And so I think the Dark Ages is characterizing this time period from a particular standpoint. And then kind of what happens later is just that Europe kind of joins that cosmopolitan global network.
So someone in that space, in that time, it's like we're living in ages, and then it's after the fact we felt the need to say, well, by contrast to the explosion that happened, it was pretty dark time. So, and that's kind of where that vibe comes from?
Absolutely. So you see a lot of production of really impressive literary output. You see a really strong French lay tradition. You see really strong Romance traditions. And so to insinuate that there isn't really any cultural production, there isn't really anything that we would kind of consider thoughtfully done, I think is inaccurate. And like you're saying, I think the people living in that time period wouldn't necessarily have thought this is objectively worse than something that has happened, and we are looking for things to get objectively better. I think especially for kind of everyday people living their lives, I don't think the Dark Ages were very much different from what came before, or really from what kind of came after. I think there were a lot of much more gradual changes. I think the term Dark Ages kind of enforces this idea that there was that maybe a century turned over or a year turned over and suddenly everything was different. When I think the lived experience and the way that history always unfolds is that there are smaller incremental changes that kind of build over time. And so I think that's a lot of, the other term that people will be fairly familiar with is the Renaissance. And that is often seen as the breaking point, right? That there is like a major radical shift between the medieval period and the early modern period. And what a lot of scholars today would say is that most of the seeds of the Renaissance actually are planted and kind of start growing during the medieval period. So this idea that they're completely different, I think, is a a little historically inaccurate, and not accurate to the way that people would have understood their own experience.
So it's kind of like a spectrum played out over time.
Exactly.
Of what we now would refer to as less informed to an enlightened kind of and something that you touched on that I think was really interesting. It's important to keep in mind that the Dark Ages, when you hear the words the Dark Ages, and you think about what else do we call ages, like the Ice Age, these are, it's the perception is that it's global, but it really wasn't global. It was actually fairly localized. It just happened to be in a very important part to us as Americans that we relate to, is where we come from. But it was, the world was starting to expand in wonderful ways as far as trade goes, and bringing enlightenment and new thought to the world. And then that, it's almost like the Renaissance or the Enlightenment, or however you want to contextualize it, was the world finding its way into Europe and changing it.
Exactly. I'm trying to think of the author who said this, but the reason that Europe was able to reach out and grasp riches when they kind of began their voyages of colonization is because there were riches to reach out to in the first place. And so I think there are especially... globally, there are just many cultures that had highly developed forms of art and like national kind of epic poetry, and that had a lot of the markers of what we would consider to be kind of modern, elements of modern globalized worlds. A lot of those cultures were well underway by the time that Europe kind of got out of its own way to be able to contact that. So there had to be something to reach out to and grasp in order for Europe to sort of have the experience that they did. So
the Renaissance, which the word is often meant to be like a time of change, a time to go from darkness to light, or what have you. That also was a fairly localized thing. So it was localized maybe to that section of Europe. And when they came and they joined the heightened consciousness of the rest of the world, did that enlightenment have an impact on the rest of the world too? Like, oh, Europe's with us now, we can really do fun stuff, kind of thing.
Yes. So first of all, there are a couple of different things where, we use this term Renaissance, I think, as if to say that everyone kind of got on the same bandwagon all at the same time. And that is also, a little contested. So Italy and the Italian Renaissance kind of happens a little bit before something like the English Renaissance. And so with the emergence of a variety of nation states, there are also kind of a variety of different time periods when different cultures are also making, kind of entering into the more globalized community. But then, I think the other kind of difficult thing is that, the Renaissance has really held up as this moment of kind of global triumph. But that was also incredibly complicated. So historically, and from, my expertise is in travel narratives, English travel narratives specifically. And there are narratives that kind of talk about the one that vilified the Spanish, who were the English's major political rival, but that just recount all of the different elements of contact that are happening. And so you're thinking about in Tenochtitlan, in what's now Mexico, where you're thinking about Cusco, you're thinking about all of these incredibly advanced cities that kind of end up getting sacked by colonists. So it's not necessarily all positive, and to suggest that I think anytime there is an encounter with enormous wealth, anytime there's an encounter with new people or new ideas, there's always bound to be conflict. And so that is one of the things that I think scholars of the, what we would call the Renaissance time period would emphasize today, is that it's not necessarily a blanket positive for the world. And I think there are a lot of scholars who would kind of connect some elements of what we're living through today, especially in terms of in our ideas about and our approach to the environment as kind of stemming from this time period, as not necessarily being a positive. And so it's a complicated time, to be sure.
And I absolutely want to spend some time talking about the correlations between the Dark Ages and contemporary society. But before we do that, I want to touch on something, religion and the role that it played, because it was, I mean, and again, I'm coming from an uninformed, pedestrian kind of viewpoint, just my understanding, my cheap person's understanding, my barstool patron version of life is that the Dark Ages were dark because of a lot of religious oppression, or like religion had a very heavy hand in determining what day-to-day life was like, and it was kind of restrictive. And then when the Enlightenment came along, or the Renaissance came along, religion still played an incredibly deep role in that transformation and the embracing of the new world. They actually facilitated it to the point where they were funding science, they were funding art, and they basically backed the explosion. Do you see? First of all, do you see that as accurate? And second of all, how did that happen? How do you stay a player in a game that's just totally changed?
One of the major elements of religious practice kind of during the medieval period has to do with the maintenance of manuscripts. And so really it was monks who were doing most of the copying. So one of the kind of the definitions of the term Renaissance is really more of a rediscovery. And one of the things that kind of get rediscovered are a lot of ancient philosophical texts. So we get a rediscovery of Aristotle, we get a rediscovery of Plato. We kind of get these older philosophical kind of classical influences that end up returning. And the reason that they return is because abbeys and monasteries kept a record. And I think one of the things that it is difficult to really wrap your head around is the implication of writing as a technology. I think we're surrounded by so much technology today. You know, we have in our pocket, we have more technology than took people to the moon, right? And I think it's really easy to forget that that writing is really an important technological development, and printing as well is really important. But books were incredibly expensive. They required a lot of, you needed the hide to be able to make the pages. You needed oftentimes very expensive dyes and inks. You needed to have an educated group of people to be able to copy them. And so that just wasn't accessible on a wide scale. And so there's a very select kind of group of people who could maintain those written traditions. And then kind of down the line, what that means is that, you know, then you have more of an oral tradition. And in some of those religious oral practices, you're really kind of depending on someone who can read to interpret those readings for you. And I think that's especially true in the English context. Catholic Mass would be often read in Latin, and a lay person wouldn't really know Latin. And so they would be, you know, kind of dependent on, they would be dependent on their priests to be interpreting that for them. But religion is also overwhelmingly like a massive, social, it's a social activity, right? And it gives a lot of definition, I think, to social action. So I think kind of the collective action too of it's the harvest season. What are we all going to be doing? It's the planting season, it gives a lot of shape to that. And so I think there's also a lot of important work that religious institutions are doing in the medieval period. So then in the transition to kind of then the early modern period, one of the major challenges of the Reformation, one is, first of all, you have Henry, who would like to be divorced from his wife. And so that kind of sparks a massive change. But at the same time, there's the rise of the printing press. There are translations of the Bible that move out of Latin, out of Hebrew into vernacular languages. So English at this time, now we sort of think of English as a very global language. But at the time, it was kind of a small dialect. England is a small island, and it didn't necessarily get involved in global affairs until relatively later in comparison to Italy, Spain, and Portugal. And so you get these translations of the Bible into English, and that enables a much wider readership. The printing press is making manuscripts, making books much more affordable. And so you might then move, and literacy is still, I think, something that is reserved for the upper class. It's not necessarily that, we reach a certain year and all of a sudden everybody went through the same K-12 education and we all know how to read. But there are more people who are directly reading those sources for themselves. And then there are these major questions of, well, I don't know if I agree with the way that you've said that this passage means this, but now that I've read it, I'm not sure that I agree. And so that's, I think there's a little bit of, I think there's a lot of room then for continued uncertainty and for disagreement. And I think that's kind of what happens during that period is there are suddenly a lot more people interpreting the same texts and they have a lot of disagreement.
So in a way, the Renaissance isn't necessarily a point of inflection so much as it is the opening parentheses of a period of transition that you could argue that industrialization was a second iteration of that Renaissance because industrialization made printing even more accessible and brought down the cost of paper and made things more accessible to everyone, distribution channels and things like that. So the Renaissance could be a larger epoch than we really imagined, all the way to Eli Whitney, I guess.
Absolutely.
Eli Whitney is part of the Renaissance. That's a weird thing to think about. That's a really interesting point to make. And also, thank you for a clarification on the role of the church in that, because my view, I'm informed by Monty Python, where I'm watching people get, the Inquisitions or whatever. And then all of a sudden we're now it's we've got a Vatican museum full, 9 miles full of paintings and stuff like that. And we're just celebrating. We're using that societal change to start to celebrate instead of I want to say keep down, because again, I'm picturing Monty Python, that's the image that comes to my head, but that's not necessarily the case. It's religion rides this wave.
Absolutely. Well, and I think, we see all of those, there are a lot of cathedrals, and there are so many incredible pieces of art. I mean, I'm thinking, Notre Dame is both architecturally gorgeous, and quite religiously important. But there are a lot of incredible pieces of art that are put into kind of telling those stories from the Bible in a visual way. And part of that is because people can't read. And so when you're in the middle of a religious ceremony and you're kind of trying to keep everybody's attention and you're trying to impart the meaning, you can't necessarily do that with words. And so one of the ways that it's kind of important to do that is through things like elaborate altar paintings and the kind of the gold finery. Those are all important elements of telling a story in a very visual way. And so I think those are also markers of a pre-literate culture, where afterwards, I think as people began reading and began making their own meaning, some of those visual markers become that's also a big piece of the Reformation, is that, someone, a Protestant would come by later and say, that's really an affront, that's offensive to God. This is, what are you worshiping? All of these gold, this gold finery, when really what you should be attending to is your relationship with God. But that is also, I'm not a religion scholar, so right. I think it's certainly more complicated, but really, I think the visual nature of a lot of those artworks is much more reflective of the literacy of the culture than it is necessarily any one thing that the church is supporting or not supporting.
So it's like cave paintings on steroids,
Exactly.
much more graceful cave paintings. We're telling the story pictorially, and this is kind of like a stepping stone that will hold your hand until you learn to read, kind of a thing. So,
yeah.
So in addition to the role of the church before, after, during, there were economic ramifications of this burst of awakening. You talk about, because some people lost their industries, like, and weavers in particular, I heard, were like almost decimated because of Silk Road and stuff like that. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I think one of the examples is that I'm sort of familiar with, that I'm working with right now, but as trade gets underway, for example, in England had been exporting wool for quite a long time, and their wool products were considered to be very fine, very high quality, and it was a major part of the English economy. Well, once the kind of the Silk Road and imports of silk through Turkey and through the Levant get underway, all of a sudden these silk materials, the silk fabrics, become the new standard of luxury. And so if you're kind of in comparison, and England is a cold, kind of damp place, and so wool is especially useful there. But if you are in somewhere like Spain, or if you're in the south of France, or if you're in Italy, silk material is more comfortable, maybe more suited for the weather. And so there starts to be this major shift in the way that imports and exports work. Later on, I think that there's the famous example of the Luddites, where, and this is significantly later, but with the advent of kind of mechanized spinning, there are people that smash looms kind of throughout the English countryside as a response to the loss of their industry. And so I think this is, again, one of these things where, we think about globalization, and we think about kind of cultural cosmopolitanism and how that's such a net positive thing. But there are a lot of moments of friction. And for individuals, that does sometimes mean kind of like the loss of a livelihood, or a major change. And so, I think this perception sort of that, I think there's this linear kind of idea that everything just continued to get better, and there are all of these moments where you think, well, maybe not for some individuals. Maybe on a broader cultural scale, sure, we see more. We see adaptation. We see greater social mobility. We see the ability for people to kind of work around. There and transcend some of their the class standing in which they're born. You see this like rising kind of merchant class. You see rising wealth in general, but kind of at the cost. Not everyone was able to make that transition.
Yeah. That I'm torn between wanting to go there, because that was such a great segue into contemporary society, but I'm going to hold back on that for a second, because so many allegories popped in my head as you were going through there. I hold on. We're gonna get there. But before we do that, I want to talk. You had used language that I thought was really interesting on the emergence of utopias. Can we talk a little bit about that? Because that phrase is so beautiful and so inspiring, and I want to get your thoughts on, first of all, what was it, and what did it look like? Yeah.
So the first utopia, titled Utopia, written in Latin, is, utopia is no place. And so it's sort of the rise of, and it was written as a religious critique, but is set up as, kind of this, has an elaborate frame narrative, but is a story about an encounter that the author had with a traveler who was telling him about this incredible place that he had visited. And it was, in theory, the perfect society. And it outlined kind of all of the steps that they took. It outlined a bit of their everyday life. There were some elements where, gold and jewels are seen as the trifles for children. There are important rotations where everyone has to spend a certain number of years farming, and then they can kind of choose whether to remain farmers or not. It outlines some of the political kind of workings and sort of the isolationism of the people. They lived on, even though it's now an island, it was once a peninsula, and it was kind of a massive government project to separate. They wanted to separate themselves from the mainland. But I think the really interesting thing So that's a 16th century text, but there are a number of other utopias that follow. So if we see, we see utopia, but we also see the New Atlantis. We also see a new world called the Blazing World, and so there's this real interest then in kind of sparking this genre about, what would the perfect society look like, and what kind of technological developments could there be? What is the relationship to knowledge, to science? Especially Francis Bacon's The New Atlantis is very interested in having a kind of a scientific council. Margaret Cavendish's New World called the Blazing World is also very interested in having scientific input, and so these texts, I think, are speculative fiction, and they're being written at a time when the known world did expand significantly, and the discovery of the Americas was a major shock to Europeans. They were not anticipating that the American continents existed at all. And so for them, thinking about, okay, there's something completely undiscovered here that we couldn't even have surmised, really opens up a lot of kind of creative possibilities. And I think there's, throughout the medieval period and the early modern period, the blending between fact and fiction is not as clear-cut as what we would say today. And so there are bestiaries that have unicorns next to rhinoceroses, or that have California bears next to something like a lamia. And that is something that I think we today would be potentially troubled by, or that is just would be very unfamiliar to be reading a text that, is claiming that something obviously fantastic, with an animal of fantasy is the same as a real animal. But I think especially for a lot of Europeans, all of these animals seem fairly fantastic. And so that's sort of I think that's where the utopia then is this really exciting opportunity to be thinking about knowledge is changing, and what we know to be true is vastly expanding. And how can we speculate then on what the future will be like when we are realizing that the world as we know it and our attempts to describe the world as we know it are just as surprising as our wildest dreams. And so I think there's this really interesting connection between those utopia kind of speculative fiction pieces and science fiction today, so that we do a lot of the same kind of work of applying what we know about people, what we know about politics, and speculating about an imagined future. What will things look like? Will we establish life on Mars? Will we establish life on the moon? There are also people in the early modern period who are thinking, what is up on the moon? And so I think that in some ways that those texts are not as far removed as we would like to think.
Yeah, it's green cheese, duh. Everybody knows that. So that brings up an interesting point. Did you? It's about narratives, the establishment of narratives, because it's easy to look at that period. And the reason that I have an opinion about what the Dark Ages might have looked like is because I've seen the narrative provided by Monty Python. But there are micro narratives baked into that in real time. I'm thinking, is there any evidence of a public relations campaign style thing that said, whoa, too much change, we got to protect the weavers' rights or something like that?
Oh, absolutely. So one of the challenging thing, let me back up. So at the time, there's a thriving, especially with the advent of the printing press, kind of throughout the end of the 16th and into the 17th century, there's a thriving, they're called Broad Street publications. I might need to look that up. But there's kind of a thriving pamphleting and tradition where instead of publishing like a book, you would have a much more public, kind of printed on pretty cheap paper. There were political tracts, there were religious tracts, there were all sorts of different, what you would think of, I think, as a little bit more like town square type publications that were voicing opinions. And the difficulty with some of those publications is that they they're fairly hard to preserve. So they were printed on loose leaf pieces of paper. They were sort of read more like a newspaper, crumpled up, tossed out, recycled. And so the record of all of the debate, we don't necessarily have a record of everything, but there's enough that survives that we know that this was a really rich part of English culture, at least. I don't want to speak for all of Europe, but definitely in England, there was there certainly would have been an attempt to define and redefine different things. So one of the examples is whether or not the theater is, I think now we would say, oh, the theater is sort of a high-minded, that's sort of an intellectual or a high-class kind of form of entertainment. It's very different from, say, TV. But at the time, there was a lot of question about whether it was moral at all to be engaging with the theater, and whether or not the theater was just a bunch of fancy and lies versus whether you could take a moral lesson from a theatrical performance, what it meant that the actors were really pretending to be completely different people, whether that might have kind of an impact on a person. And so that's just one example where there was a furious kind of pamphleteering conversation that was happening, where someone would write something that would say, you shouldn't go to the theater if you're a moral person at all. And then somebody else would say, well, that's not actually true. There are some benefits to the theater. And if we look to our ancient scholars, if we look to Aristotle, if we look, if we look to some of these older figures, they would agree. And I think, so there definitely were attempts at shaping the narrative on that micro level, but then also kind of on that macro level.
And I guess in the end of the scrum, the people ended up deciding. Because I mean, you look at the Globe Theater. The Globe Theater was that's where people got their news from Shakespeare, or that's where they got their societal commentary from. So,
yeah, I think there were some people who I think never really came around. But I think it was the theater was so popular and supported an entire local economy of breweries and taverns and places to eat, and there was a massive kind of economic value, and I think there are also a lot of monarchs that really found value to supporting Shakespeare. I think Shakespeare's company was called the Queensmen under Queen Elizabeth, and then transitioned to the Kingsmen under James I. And so I think in a lot of ways the theater was used both for social critique and also as a way for authority figures to influence society. So I think that's one that goes both ways.
That's part of that public relations campaign. You take advantage of what you have. You can use a book, you can use a theater. I think that's really wonderful. And that actually, now let's get into the correlation. Now let's jump ahead, because this is where I feel like there's just so much conversation to be had. You've studied the pattern, right? At least a part of it. Do you see anything that looks like that pattern represented in contemporary society?
Oh, absolutely. So one of the things that I have been thinking about a lot is the early modern period really was a time of technological innovation. So we see, and I work on voyages, and again, thinking about technology in sort of this slantwise way. But you're thinking about like the development of maps, for example, and the development of navigational tools. And that really changes the way that especially people in England were really understanding both the world and their place in it. But it was also, that also opens up a lot of questions. So, Galileo invents the telescope, and that kind of throws off this idea of, does the sun revolve around the earth, or does the earth revolve around the sun? I mean, that's a pretty foundational question for how the universe works. And those are questions that are being debated kind of at this time. You have Kepler, you have Copernicus, you have all of these kind of mathematicians and figures who are working from different angles to figure things out. But I think all of that comes kind of circles back around to this idea of then what do you do with authority? So there had been sort of these, you've got it on good word that the sun revolves around the earth. There, like, that is sort of what, like, the authority, the political, the religious, the scientific kind of authorities are all confirming. And then that radically changes. And I think that we are in a moment like that, especially with computing. I think we are seeing a lot of those. I think we're coming back to some of those questions about different elements of the practice of science. But I think this main question of how do we know who is telling the truth, I think is a major question that was shaking up things kind of in the 16th, 17th century that I think we really are deeply encountering today. And so I think, I wouldn't say that there's not a single person that kind of comes out of this time period to say, follow me, or if there were figures that were saying that, you might look at that with a little bit of skepticism. But I think eventually different methods, different ways of kind of understanding things do start to emerge. And so I think with a little bit of time, that certainty kind of, we learn to grapple with some of that uncertainty. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about studying literature from this time. You think, why it's 400 years later, 500 years later, why are we still reading Shakespeare? Why does John Milton still matter? But I think that those questions of what do we do in the face of uncertainty were unanswered then, I think are still unanswered today. But it's part of the condition of being human. Kind of living with uncertainty is something that we all have to navigate kind of in different times. And so I think being able to look back and have this incredible wealth of texts that are people grappling with those same questions, I think there's a lot of solace in that. And I think, one of the things that I think it's comforting to not be alone in that, and to see such a rich history of all of these figures who are, genius figures, people who are doing incredible things, but to see that they grapple with those very human questions, I think is in some ways is comforting. That the the most human thing you can do then is grapple with what it means to be human.
and I would go one further and say we have the added benefit of the perspective of seeing how it worked out, historically. What could we have, if we could have pulled the wand and said, let's change this about that time so that we got this result. We have that luxury now, and we happen to sit at that time now. As you were talking about utopias, I know that there are utopias today that are being generated that are, we're talking about. We can now produce food without soil. We can hydroponic. We can grow food in abandoned buildings where the food is needed. So that reduces the reliance on logistics. We have a greater understanding now of how to live in harmony with this planet than we've ever had. We arguably, as far as technology goes, we can build homes that don't require an electric grid, that gather their energy from the atmosphere, from the sun, from the wind, from the tides. We can sequester water and use that. And so we just become a lot more harmonious with the planet. What keeps us from actually acting on these things is that kind of PR campaign that says, no. You're causing too much damage or something like that, or you're being funded by someone with nefarious intent, like whoever. So I look at this is an opportunity. Like if we could look back on that period of time and apply the lessons learned and just say, they tried this, that didn't work so well. Maybe if they would have done this, it would have worked better. And we can allegorize that and create a new utopia these days. And I see so much of that. Would you agree? Do you see that dynamic playing out?
Yeah. And I think, like you said, being able to learn some of those lessons from the time period, I think the Renaissance was so deeply unequal, and we're still sort of living through the ramifications 100 400 years later, and those kinds of things tend to build. And so I think, like you're saying, on the contrary side, we do have so much innovation. We have so much technology. We have the ability to change things, I think, for good or for ill. And I think, I'm not, I'm a literary scholar. I'm not a historian, but one of the things studying studying texts kind of in this older context is really the contingency of history, that you get one kind of idea of history and you think, well, of course it would have unfolded this way or that way. And then you sort of start digging into the material and you realize it was kind of a choice. There were many different ways, many different modes of unfolding that history could have taken, and it just so happened to kind of fall down the way that it did. And so I think, especially as we are looking into the future, there are so many things that feel inevitable. I think the destruction of the planet is something that is close to me personally, but also, you hear about young people with climate anxiety. You hear about the ways that weighs heavily kind of on the world, and we may have gotten to, or we're moving past some of these quote unquote tipping points, but that doesn't really mean that we can give up, because every step that kind of limits warming, or every here on Davis's campus, every creek or river that gets restored, every single species that is saved, like those are all worthwhile fights. And so I think that is something that, that having this more, there's less certainty. But I think having more of this contingent view of history, it just opens up so many more possibilities.
And as you pointed out, excuse me, the consequences are greater. I mean, we're some people are using language like extinction level events and things like that if we don't address climate change per se. But also, if I were to draw an allegory from the Dark Ages, it was, those times were localized. What we consider to be the Dark Ages were localized. The rest of the world was flourishing. And just like I like that, I think that dynamic is replicated today. Like you can see that pattern. A lot of other countries in the world get it, and they're taking, meaningful action. And some have reached energy parity, where green energy is more affordable, or as affordable as fossil fuel generated energy. People are moving in the right direction, or doing the right thing, and they're seeing tremendous results. One of my favorite examples was COVID. I mean, I hate to point back at COVID and say, hey, what a great time that was. But if you looked at like satellite maps in COVID, and you saw when people stopped driving because they were quarantined, immediately the atmosphere cleaned up. And immediately we saw a decrease, ironically, in like respiratory diseases, because there was not as much nitrogen in the air. Things like that are very meaningful. And so we understand these things to be true. Mm-hmm. Informing, and the rest of the world sees that and says, we got a solution. We know how to do that. We can fix that. We can create electric vehicles that do not pump carbon into the atmosphere, or we can control our nitrogen emissions in factories and manufacturing. And I know I'm going down a rabbit hole, but trust me, it's going to pay off in a second. I look at the decisions that we're making now in this country, and I say it doesn't represent the world. And I think we benefit from what maybe Dark Ages people in Europe didn't have, which is like an internet and a global communication system where we can actually see what's going on in real time. Do you think that if Europe had an internet, had a World Wide Web, had social media, would it have ended quicker?
Oh, that's a great question. And that maybe, I think having a less centralized, kind of more individualized access point, I think would really have changed and we have seen has changed the course of history. That people being able to tell their own stories kind of to a wider public has even changed things. But I think one of the interesting things that you're talking about with some of the these bigger changes, right? We're talking about how do we limit global temperature rise? How do we do, for the good of the planet, we will reduce cars, we'll take cars off the road, we'll support public transportation, things like that. I think it's really easy to think that those are macro, that those really only will impact people's lives on a macro scale. And I think, through a lot of our conversation, we're talking about how, what was it like as an individual kind of living through a time of transition. But I think the other exciting part about some of the changes that you mentioned to address climate change, I think the city of Paris is a reasonable example where they kind of did away with a lot of their car infrastructure. And that is just making people's lives better because they can walk places and their city is more beautiful. And by planting trees, like the city is cooler. And so there are all of these sort of things where, I think the overall narrative is also about, these like macro, terrifying, humanity level problems. And as an individual, it's really hard to be thinking about problems that big. But there are also all these incredible benefits to individuals. And I know for one, as someone who comes to Davis predominantly via the bus, like my own blood pressure is much lower when I take the bus than when I drive because there's a lot of construction and it's stressful. And so I think, even as we are kind of keeping these bigger kind of superseding stories in mind, I think it is also useful to kind of bring that back down to the way that some of those changes will actually benefit everybody individually.
So I think we just solved it. I mean, I think if I were to put an elegant cap on this, and please feel free to trump me or to build on this, I think there's hope because I think we can look back at the Dark Ages and say, they came out of that into a much better world, and I think we're seeing a lot of correlation between what we're going through right now and what lays on the other side. If we just embrace that utopia, I think we could probably make it reality. You think so?
I hope so.
All right. That's the spirit. Thank you. It was great talking to you today.
Thank you.
Sincerest thanks to today's guest, Mikhaila Redovian. If you'd like to learn more about Mikhaila and her work, check out our YouTube page for links to her bio, books, articles, research, and more. And thank you for joining Minds Over Matters today. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe, share with your friends, and spread the word. We have a lot to say, and we guarantee something for everyone. Minds Over Matters is hosted by Ed Kiggins, produced by the College of Letters and Science at UC Davis, and filmed at the Wyatt Pavilion. Thanks for listening. See you next time.